Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of Save Corrupted, a podcast about video games, archival, and why they deserve to be preserved in the first place. My name is Liam, I'll be your host for this evening, and this is a sort of opening note about the structure of today's episode, and about why I chose this particular guest to interview on a video games podcast. The episode can be pretty cleanly divided into two halves. The first half is about Dr. Tom Chandler's work on the Virtual Angkor project, which is a kind of virtual reconstruction / simulation of the medieval Cambodian city of Angkor, including the temple complex known as Angkor Wat, more vastly well known than the city itself, but is much larger than that complex. It's simply breathtaking, the sheer amount of this kind of medieval Cambodian civilization, which is rendered within this program and which you can explore and have a look at. It's pretty incredible stuff. So naturally I spent a decent amount of time talking to him about it. As to why I felt it was important to talk about it at such length, one, I think it's intrinsically interesting, and I anticipate that many of you will agree with me. There's simply so much that most people like myself don't know about Cambodia, much less medieval Cambodia and the history of the Khmer people. So it's interesting to learn a bit more about that intrinsically. But secondly, there is a more indirect relevance to the mission of the show, so to speak. Within the episode, there is a theme in our discussion that's constantly repeated, and that is that there are so many holes, so much that is not known about the past through to lack of evidence, for whatever reason, whether it was destroyed by an act of war, intentional sabotage, environmental degradation, political upheaval, just being lost. So much. There is so much that is missing, and as a result, the image that we can develop of the past is patchwork at best. And so this kind of worry, which is real and present, a real and present consideration in historical studies, is something that I want future histories of games to avoid. We can try and avoid that the best we can. Obviously, no effort at preservation will be perfect. There are limitations inherent to any such project. But I think if we try and do our best to militate against these threats, then a hypothetical history of games from the future will actually represent our moment with a greater degree of accuracy and empathy and humanity than would otherwise be possible. So I think the difficulties inherent in the reconstruction of what Angkor looked like in the past kind of speak to the necessity for us to preserve and for us to develop a culture, a storytelling culture, surrounding the history of our medium. After all, the better that we take care of the kind of quilt of history that we'll bequeath to future generations, the less that the entropy inherent to aging, the process of time, will eat away at their image of us, the image that the future will have of our moment in time. I hope that these are considerations that animate all of you as well. So hopefully you'll find that worth listening to for both those accounts. The second half of the episode is about a couple of games that I feel have interesting things to say, both with regard to their content and methodologically, about how virtual worlds can be used as a sort of supplement to the study of history. And so we talk about Assassin's Creed, Kingdom Come Deliverance, and very briefly about the Grand Museum VR, which is like a VR experience that you can find on PC and PSVR. So I hope you enjoyed the episode, and thank you very much for listening. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Save Corrupted, a show about video game history, preservation, and why video games are worth preserving in the first place. My name is Liam, I'm your host as always, and today I'm here with a very special guest. Would you care to introduce yourself?
G'day Liam, I'm Tom Chandler. I'm at Monash, Senior Lecturer at Monash with the Faculty of IT.
Beautiful. So you have spent a decent portion of this afternoon showing me a lot of your work on the Virtual Angkor project.
Sure. Yep.
It was a fascinating presentation. I was wondering if you could go into a little detail for my listeners and explain what sort of thing you're doing.
Okay, so to explain, it's a very visual project, but I guess it's, if I really try and put it in a sentence, it's what it is to build a virtual city of the past using all the information you can get your hands on. And the particular city I'm really interested in is Angkor, a medieval city in Cambodia, capital of Cambodia. I guess you're talking from the 8th century to the 14th century.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So it's medieval. It's Southeast Asia often isn't included in the kind of medieval studies, but that's the time period. Yeah.
Yeah. So what exactly does the project consist in? What are you doing with it?
Okay, so I teach 3D modeling here, a little bit of games prototyping. So really, we are dealing with 3D models. We're dealing with 3D models of everything. So it starts with architecture, vegetation, right up to terrains, and then of course the people of Angkor, the inhabitants and the domestic animals, and all of these take a lot of time to do, and there's a lot of back and forth because we consult with experts, with historians and archaeologists all through the project. And it's really not uncommon that they all disagree with each other. So often we're kind of going back and forth and updating things, changing things with new information we get, doing new things with the models, assembling them in different ways. And there's also things like soundscapes. We do a lot of recording of sounds. They're on site, and maybe working with musicologists occasionally. So it's essentially a virtual world project using game technologies, but we're not exactly making a game. We're kind of making a very large dynamic model, and the real strength of this is to just test hypotheses in real time. And kind of draw a lot of different disciplines together. So drawing examples from art history, from architecture, from archaeology, from anthropology, from even up to epigraphy, which is the study of inscriptions, from history, even from textile studies, from all kinds. So it doesn't absorb all of these disciplines wholly. It takes little bits from each part, and we're trying to put everything into one, I guess, again, a dynamic space where ideas can be tested. Yeah. Where concepts can be visualized. And I would stress that the whole venture is really explorative rather than predictive. Yeah. So, although as the project develops, we can, I think it's some really interesting things come out of it. Yeah. Okay.
So it's important to stress, I think, that because it sounds like it's a very kind of detailed virtual model of the temple complex of Angkor Wat and the surrounding city. Yep. But you've also included things like animals and animated people moving around, kind of simulating what an ordinary person might have been doing.
Sure, and that's how we really started off. Which is we started off by modeling things like elephants and people and ox carts moving along a road, and this was many years ago because we started off really from an animation standpoint. So, for example, to model an ox cart in Cambodia, you've got lots of different moving components. You've got two oxen hauling it along. You've got the internal skeletons of those oxen, how they animate a walk cycle, how they pull that weight along the road, and then the driver who's sitting behind them. What's in the ox cart. So all of these things take time to get right. And luckily we've got some ox carts are still used in some parts of Cambodia, more so 10 years ago than now. But we had some real studies to base our models upon. So something like that could take some time. It could take about a month to put together. And I'm really lucky to have really experienced graduates working on this and animating these kind of elements, but something like that can take some time to put together. But once you have an ox cart that moves along in a repeated walk cycle, then you have convoys of them. You have thousands of them. You have them all over the city. So a lot of these things are quite scalable. And starting off from an animation standpoint is is a really interesting place to begin because, for instance, the human walk cycle, how someone will walk along carrying a load over their shoulders, a balance load, baskets suspended from poles, whether people are carrying something over their head. There's also palanquins where someone of higher status is kind of sitting in a hammock suspended in a pole that's carried by two people at either end.
Wow.
So these are symbols of status, and how that it's often how these things are carried and how they balance, and all of these things are fine details which, again, they take a while to get right to look convincing.
Yeah.
But once we've got them right, you can then repeat them over a large landscape, over many instances. You can obviously, gamers will know very well, you can change the fabrics, you can change the textiles, you can change the characters, you can transfer these cycles from to different characters to different genders. All these things are editable, but that's animation, again, is a really interesting place to start. Often these kind of historical visualization projects they'll start with the architecture first. Yeah. Because it's more of a certainty.
Well, sure.
Yeah. It's often easier to model than people.
Yeah.
And it doesn't move. So
it's handy.
Yeah. You start with the city, and then after you start with the architecture and the detailing of the architecture and other kind of features like tiles and columns and all these, and then very late in the project they might consider, well, what about the people? What about the inhabitants?
Sure.
Often they don't. Often people are absent from these projects.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's really, it might be art historical in focus. It might be archaeological in focus. That is the site itself. But the living, moving inhabitants of a place, that's often more speculative.
Yeah.
But yet we're quite sure that they were there. So I think these. Yeah. I'd like to reappraise what is a model for history. You can have an architectural model. You can have a model of terrain. You can have a model that is cartographical. It's like a map, a 3D map. But humans and animals are just as much models. And so, the thing is that they move around, and this has to be accounted for.
Yeah. It kind of seems to me that sort of approach, that kind of a conception of what a model should be, speaks to the interdisciplinary nature of this project.
Sure. Yep.
In a certain sense, it kind of mirrors the sort of the inherent interdisciplinary nature of video games, given that video games are kind of like a syncretic medium. They borrow elements from a whole bunch of other art forms to create a kind of, a new form. I think it's fair to say that there's a degree of general kind of pop historical awareness concerning, for instance, ancient Greece or Rome, if only through their depiction in historical fiction. It also seems this is absolutely not the case for Cambodia, much less medieval Cambodia.
Yeah.
So, could you please explain to my listeners what Angkor Wat is or was, and its importance in the lives of ordinary Cambodians in the 13th century?
Sure, and this is something we were talking about earlier, Liam, and this is here we are in Australia, which is really not that far away from Cambodia in international terms.
Yeah.
We've got this big civilization, big medieval civilization right up above us, really. So, first of all, Angkor Wat. Well, this is pretty well known these days. There's a lot of Australians who go there as tourists. I'm sure everyone's got brother or a cousin or a friend who's been there and talked about it. It's a very popular tourist destination. It's a World Heritage Site. So Angkor Wat is famous. It's the largest religious monument in the world. It's very well preserved. Wow. It's central to Cambodia's identity. It's on their flag. It's been on multiple flags that Cambodia has different flags over the decades, but Angkor Wat's been pretty much a constant. Today it's a Buddhist site,
right?
But originally it was built by King Suryavarman II, and we're talking about the 12th century. when it was built, it was dedicated to Vishnu, and so it faces west, which is a different orientation to a lot of the other temples at Angkor. It's also, I think it's important to state that Angkor, the city, the civilization, and Angkor Wat are often conflated.
Yes.
A lot of people get them mixed up, and it's understandable if you haven't been there. I guess Angkor Wat is the largest, most impressive, best preserved temple in a city of hundreds of other temples, all of them smaller than Angkor Wat.
Yeah.
And all of them in various states of ruin. The most important thing to understand is Angkor Wat is the one temple that was never abandoned at Angkor. So as the city around it kind of fell to pieces and became overgrown gradually at different stages, Angkor Wat remained a site of pilgrimage to successive kings, to often pilgrims from even as far as Japan would come there. So it wasn't rediscovered by anyone. It was always known to the Cambodians.
Yeah.
It was very central to their identity. It's just that the capital of Cambodia moved to Phnom Penh. Well, it moved around several places before settling in Phnom Penh, but so Angkor is the old capital of Cambodia, and Angkor Wat is its premier temple. And as we were saying before, I think it's fair to say it's like you've got this. The analogy breaks down after a while, but it really is like a cathedral in a Western European medieval city.
Yeah.
And then you've got all these large churches, and out towards the edges of the city, a lot of little chapels. Angkor Wat is really the cathedral that's still preserved there. So, getting back to Cambodian history, that's why it's so important to Cambodia.
Yeah.
And it's still a place of pilgrimage today, and such a renowned World Heritage Site. I think it's got over. I'd have to check the figures, but I believe it's well over 2 million visitors a year.
Not surprising.
Yes, could be up as high as 6 million now.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I guess thinking about the Khmer civilization of Angkor, you really, the classic Angkor period, you're really talking about 8th century to roughly 14th century.
Yeah.
But it's really important to understand it's not a lost civilization, it's rather a capital of Cambodia that was gradually abandoned, except for Angkor Wat, and kind of became the romantic vision is it got overtaken by forests and the towers with faces on them overgrown with vines.
Yes.
This is all true. This is what happened. But the people there, they spoke Khmer. They were ethnically Khmer, and that's the same people who live there now today. So they're certainly not a lost people.
Yeah.
And Angkor is still within Cambodia. Cambodia was once a much larger country, and the Angkorian Empire ruled over much of what is now Laos and Thailand and Peninsular Malaysia and most of southern Vietnam. Cambodia has now shrunk back a lot, but Angkor is still in the heartland there. So the culture continues, and there is a lot of continuity, even though they change religion. Gods like Vishnu and Shiva and Ganesha.
Yeah.
These, if you go to the modern Wats of Cambodia, the Buddhist Wats, if you have a look at some of the tattoos that some of the Khmer guys have, these gods still exist there.
Yeah.
Wow. The religion is Theravada Buddhist, but the gods have never really gone away. The old gods, they're still around. Yeah,
it's incredible how they can just survive that process and remain there in a certain sense.
Yeah, I know. It is interesting. Yeah, it is because you've got these Brahmanic religions which come from India, and then you've got Buddhism which comes from India as well.
Yeah,
and at Angkor there were Buddhists. There were people who followed various. They were Vaishnavite or Shaivite, which is followers of Shiva or Vishnu. There were, and there's two different types of Buddhism. There's Mahayana Buddhists, which are Tibetan Buddhism being an example, and Theravada Buddhist, which is the southern school of Buddhism. And analogies are they're a bit dangerous, but it's kind of similar to Catholicism and Protestantism.
Right.
Which one's the more basic and which one's the more ornate, and has more ritual and more saints. And then there's Protestantism, which is a little bit more pared back and back to basics. So all of these religions were at Angkor, and different kings were following sometimes different gods. Sometimes they were Mahayana Buddhists, particularly Jaivarman VII, who's very, very famous, the one who built most of the large temples at Angkor. But then I guess this conversion to Theravada Buddhism, where Cambodia is today. Some historians say this played a really big part in Angkor's decline, because they say, well, because everyone converted to Theravada Buddhism, there wasn't this need to build these huge temples dedicated to gods, temple mountains that they could say. So that could be one factor in why these temples stopped being built. But again, yes, there's still a lot of continuity there in that these Hindu gods, they're still talked about, and you can find little shrines where they're still worshipped.
Yeah.
They're kind of compatriots of the Buddha. They're kind of woven into that same story.
Wow.
And Buddha grew up as a Hindu.
Yeah.
So there's a continuity there that's still there.
Yeah, that makes sense in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. The fact that the Angkor Wat, relative to Greater Angkor, which is kind of gradually abandoned, as you say, for various reasons.
Yep.
The fact that Angkor Wat was never totally abandoned is sort of like a minor historical miracle, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That kind of the fact that it was able to be preserved through all this conscious effort, people actually making the effort to go to the complex to keep it up, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah. While the rest of the civilization was crumbling for various reasons.
Yep.
Yeah. This is kind of relevant to the show. So this is the point you mentioned when we were talking earlier, but about inscriptions. About inscriptions, bas-reliefs, and the libraries that are around the sort of temple complex. Because you mentioned that we can still retain, like, there's some damage to the facade, so some of it is missing, but we still have a lot of the inscriptions. It's not clear what all of it means, but that stuff is able to be preserved in a certain sense because of the medium.
Yep.
But you mentioned that a lot of the libraries, the stuff in there was written on palm leaves.
Yes.
So could you talk about the problem of preserving that sort of stuff?
Sure. And just 1 second. You could. So, Liam, what I'm showing to you here is just something I have on one of my shelves, but this is something I bought in Cambodia in the markets back 10 years ago, and it's just a few leaves of palm leaf scroll with Buddhist writing on. You can hold it if you want, but you can see this is. You see, it's kind of bookended by two wooden panels.
Yeah.
And the way it's written, so it's palm leaf, but you can see the way it's written is kind of, with a stylus, it's kind of scratched into it. And that's probably very similar to how books at Angkor were kept, although they were much larger. This one's probably maybe 50 or 60 years old.
Yeah.
But... so there was no doubt. I guess that calling those structures inside the temple's libraries is a tradition.
Sure. But
they probably weren't libraries. They were probably something to do with the keeping of the sacred fire, and this is part of a Hindu ritual.
Right.
I couldn't really elaborate further onto that in that vein, but there perhaps were some texts in there.
Sure.
But that might not have been where they were kept in the traditional sense of, as we think of libraries, which is big bookcases full of scrolls and parchments and so forth.
Okay.
So, but back to the inscriptions, which are in question. This relates a lot to the enigma of Angkor. Is that you've got stone temples that are reserved for the gods, and they're built that way because they're supposed to be eternal,
right?
Like the gods.
Yes.
Everyone else lives in wooden houses. Even the king lives in a wooden palace.
Right.
So all this is perishable in a tropical country like Cambodia, where you've got monsoon seasons, wet seasons, and dry seasons. You can imagine wood doesn't preserve there very well.
Yeah.
And nor do palm scrolls. They have to be recopied every 10, 20 years they have to be recopied. And this no doubt happened at Angkor, that they were copying records from one century to the next and they were maintaining them. But when the whole civilization or the whole city started to kind of unravel in the 14th century, and there's various theories, we can get to this a little later, but what happened was the scribes stopped copying things down.
Yeah.
Or maybe the records were moved or lost or even destroyed. Nobody knows for sure, but we know that they stopped getting copied down. So all that stuff was lost.
Yeah.
And as you and I were talking about before, if this was Egypt, you could have just stashed them away underground in a dry desert environment. Parchment and papyrus would have been absolutely fine. There's no way to really do that at Angkor. You can't store them away somewhere safe and dry. So if they're not copied down, they're lost. But what we do have is lots of inscriptions in stone. So these are often on the door jambs of temples. On either side of the door, you'll get these inscriptions written in Sanskrit or Old Khmer. And these have been found all over Angkor, and indeed all over Cambodia. And they're really valuable documents. Often they're associated with temples. They're often, in terms of reading them, they're pretty dry.
Yeah.
They're like tax documents. They're like real estate conveyancing documents. Sometimes there's some eulogies to people who've died, to benefactors. They often discuss the merit of various donations to these temples, who gave the donations, lists of people who are associated with the temple. Some of them are called slaves to the temple, but we think this wasn't slaves in the traditional sense. They were kind of slaves to the god,
right?
Which is a way of saying a religious duty.
Sure.
But indeed, there were slaves. There were slaves of quite low status who perhaps captured from minorities, tribes who were living in the hills around the empire. They were probably ethnically Khmer, but didn't speak the same language as the Angkorians. So all these inscriptions are really valuable documents for determining how politics worked at Angkor, the lives of the elite, how kind of wealth was accumulated in the temples, how the society was structured. But they don't give much more of an insight into the myths and legends of stories that would have been particular to that civilization, to the deeds of royal families, and even especially the common people. A lot of that is absent.
Yeah.
There's hints of it. Sometimes there's little hints of it, but again, these are really just the inventories. A lot of these inscriptions are inventories of goods, and they're records of who gave what to the temple. So they can be quite dry, but they're useful historically.
Yeah, it definitely seems like they're useful. It says something about a civilization that they deemed these kinds of documents so important that they required stone preservation in a certain sense.
Yes, and I think these. That's the permanence of stone. It's eternal, and I think they were proved right. Here's the things that we have. All the other things disappeared, but probably these stone inscriptions were probably copies, or rather, it could have worked either way. Either they had the legal documents drawn up on palm leaf, and then they copied them out on stone to make them absolutely permanent, hard to forge, or it could have been the other way around. They were first put down on stone and also copied on palm leaf to be delivered to other people in other places, so that everyone had copies of them.
Okay,
but now the stone ones are all that remain.
Okay. Interesting. How did you go about starting this project?
I was really looking at how we could use modelling to not just to visualise a particular archaeological site or a particular monument or a particular place, but how you could use it more as a system to visualise competing ideas, competing hypotheses. And from there we start to get kind of into animation and what is it to visualize a living city of the past rather than just a dead city?
Yeah.
What is it to visualize what life was like rather than just how a monument might have looked fully reconstructed? So it trying to look at a civilization not from an architectural point of view, which is often how people first start off, as we talked about before. Yeah.
Okay. So I remember you were describing the way that your work has been received by archaeologists.
Yes.
And the sort of summary is that more maps. Why isn't this more like a map?
Yes. Yep.
But
well, look, it's generally been positive, but I mean, I think it's been maybe. I think now, it's the change in demographics. It's the change in the age of academics in archaeology. It's also the change in what the students are doing and what the postgraduates are doing. I think now there's a general acceptance that virtual worlds with computer-generated characters and 3D architecture and 3D landscapes, there's general acceptance now that these are conceptual, simulated worlds and they're not real.
Yeah.
Whereas early 2000s, when people were making visualizations of the past that were very concerned with photorealism and how great everything looked, because it was hard to do.
Well,
it was hard to get these really realistic looking graphics. And back then, I think, understandably, a lot of historians, archaeologists had big problems with this, because they said, well, you got these fantastic looking buildings of the past. And often they were doing it for Rome and Egypt and other... But it's not really clear how you came up with these ideas, and why does everything just look so great? You know, have you really considered all the other angles about this? And how can you be so sure that it was this one particular way?
Yeah. That
it looked this particular way? So I think what's happened now, since then, I think that there's an understanding that these kind of virtual worlds where the people and the buildings and the artifacts, they look real enough to be consistent within that computer game world.
Yep.
But they don't look exactly real. They look CGI.
Yeah.
They have a certain aesthetic that anyone can see that these are computer generated. They all work together, and it's convincing in itself. It's like a game world. It's not reality.
Yeah.
It's a simulation of reality. So I think this is one of the main uses for these. I think it's a perfect medium for hypothetical explorations of history and archaeology.
Yeah.
Precisely because of that quality. It's real and believable, just like a game world.
Yep.
But it's not a simulation of reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of just realistic enough to draw you in and kind of get you engaged in that sort of respect.
Exactly.
But there's also that element of differentiation where you understand that you are exploring a particular way of viewing things. A particular hypothetical imagination of what the past could have looked like.
That's exactly right. And it's almost impossible to know exactly. But I think it what this kind of medium can do is it brings different elements together that weren't there before. These are always obvious to gamers, but it's not yet all that obvious to kind of historical exploration or historical imagination. It's been done in films for a long time, but it's only really starting to be looked at properly in games in the last 10 years or so. Not very long. What would things sound like? That's a big question.
Yeah.
It's not just creating a wonderful 3D rendering that you can put on a poster or put on the put somewhere on the internet as a JPEG. No, it's actually what would these environments sound like? Sound is dimensional, so you have to kind of move around. What does it sound like in a pre-industrial city? There's a big question just in itself.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, compared to today, So, what other things can you bring into it? Well, we talked about animation a lot.
Hello everyone, Liam from the future tuning in to let you know that at this point in the recording, Tom had an unexpected visitor to his office, and naturally that cut us off mid-sentence and we weren't able to find our way back, so there's an unbridgeable chasm in the base recording. So I thought I'd take advantage of this sort of intermission by necessity to let you know that in the description for this episode, as it will be uploaded to iTunes, podcast player, etc., YouTube, and obviously to the main website, and thus also the Facebook page that I will post a link to. In that description, I will include a link to Tom's work on Virtual Angkor. There's a couple of presentations. I believe that they were designed for an educational context, but you should be able to have a look and to see some of the modelling, so you can actually get a visual sense. He said at the start of the show that it is a very visual project, and so there is a bit that's lost due to the fact that this is an audio-based medium. But hopefully that kind of supplementary material will really hammer home the sort of the impact that this sort of work potentially could have, and why we're both so excited about it. So I hope you enjoy looking at those materials, and we'll get back to the episode. So something that you seem very proud of in the way that you showed the work to me was the agent simulation.
Yep.
Yeah, so could you please explain what that means and how it's similar or different to AI as it appears in games?
Sure. We're proud of it because we just got it working, and it looks great if you zoom up about 100 meters into the air and you see all these little characters walking around. Looks really complicated. In fact, there's not much behind it, and there's a lot more we have to do. So what we're I guess agent simulation. When I talked earlier about how we started off with animation, well, about 3 or 4 years ago, we started to make a really large-scale model of Angkor Wat because we had new information on new archaeological surveys on the site. So we put all the architecture together, but we already had all these little walking people. They just didn't have any brains. They were just animated people that would just walk in a straight line forever. They had some, they had some animated motion loops and other things, but they weren't really programmed human characters yet. So we used a pretty simple A-star algorithm, which is a pathfinding algorithm. So I guess the AI is really limited just to pathfinding. So you've got this Angkor Wat, a really large square site, and you've got an entry at the back of the complex and an entry at the front. You've got various little exits around it, but what's really fascinating about it is you've got these kind of choke points from people coming from the outside of the city going into the walled complex, and they're moving around, maybe going inside the temple, coming out of the temple, going to various residents inside the compound walls, and then coming out again. So you've got these crowds kind of flowing in and out. And that's how we used AI so far. Yeah. And it's just what we did is it's kind of, at the moment, it's like a large crowd simulation. So you've got estimates for Angkor Wat back when it was operational in the 12th century, just after it had been built. It was operational Vaishnavite religious complex. The estimates are that it probably had a workforce of 25,000. So that's people coming in to work inside the complex. People they've got duties there, a number of duties. Mm-hmm. They could have been people who were stonemasons, right? You know, carving specific reliefs, or carefully putting together some of the specialized architectural features of the temple. They could have been dancers who were decked out in all kinds of gold jewelry, and these were ritual dancers and musicians who accompanied them. There was all the priests. There was all those layers of society. There was also probably the elites who were coming in from around the city to go into the temple for ritual purposes. We can't exactly say what they're doing there. Sure. So with the AI, we've got 25,000 people, and that's a lot to run through any simulation. Yeah. So we divided them up, and you've got 4 classes. You've got the elites, who are coming to visit the temple. They go into the temple, they stay for an hour, and then they kind of find their way out the same way they came. Mm-hmm. You've got all these commuting workers who are, they're going into the complex. They're going to specific locations, perhaps into the temple itself. But then they're leaving a few hours later to go home. Right. And then you've got residents who are inside the walls, and they just circulate inside the walls and go to the temple, and then back to the residences, and maybe back to the temple. And finally, you've got suppliers who go to the gates, drop something off, and then leave again.
Right.
So when we're talking about the AI, we've got these 25,000 people who are divided into these 4 classes. And the thing is, it's how they act over the cycle of 24 hours. So that's really how we set up the simulation, is that it's a day in the life of Angkor Wat, back in time. It's a hypothetical day. It's not any specific date. It's not any specific, year. Sometime in the 12th century.
Yeah.
And this is why it's really interesting to test hypotheticals, is what's the day in the life of a pre-industrial metropolis of Southeast Asia, in the 12th century. Well, one way to test it is with large amounts of people.
Yeah.
And one of the constraints of the day is obviously the climate. The middle of the day, anyone who goes to Cambodia now, especially if you go there in like the hot season, between like 11 o'clock to 2 o'clock, it's pretty much unbearable.
Oof.
So people, they retreat to shade. Yeah, today it's air conditioning, but back then you could expect that time of the day for people not exactly to have a siesta, but just there wouldn't be so much activity.
Yeah.
And all the hustle and bustle is really, where a lot of the people are moving around would be the morning and the late afternoon.
Right.
There'd be people moving around the middle of the day, but just not as much. So we're trying to look at these kind of pulses of activity from the morning and the kind of late afternoon, and then once night falls, unless there's a big festival or some important event, there's no electricity, so people they're off to bed.
Sure.
There might be some lamp lights and stuff, but they're going to get up very early again. That's just the cycle of the day. So it's really that cycle of the day depended on climate, depended on culture, depended on the actual religion, all these little factors. How the temple operates. It's going to be different in other parts of the world, in other climates, and other cultures. And these are some of the specific things we're trying to simulate in very, very broad terms here.
Yeah.
And it's exactly that kind of broad simulation, which it's fairly simple. You've got these pretty simple rules for these little walking agents, and often they're not just walking, but often they're sitting around and they're waiting. They're doing a lot of waiting and a lot of sitting as well as moving.
Yeah.
So simple rules, but large numbers of them, and you get kind of emergent results. Which you didn't expect.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you've got different classes of agents, you've got some parts of the temple that are reserved for the elites, or particularly residents which might have duties there and not the others. So you can track like where all these people are circulating around, all with their little random pathfinding algorithms. So, that's the extent of the AI at the moment. Would like to develop it a lot further.
Of course.
But I don't want to, I don't want to oversell it. That's where it is at the moment.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah, we've all learned our lessons from Peter Molyneux. You've got to try and keep things within reason.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something that I'm getting is that there is it's very clear that this kind of work, as a simulation, is not the same as building a virtual world that you would use interactively for a game.
Yes.
There are disanalogies.
Yes.
But there are plenty of things that do seem like could be applied. Might be transferable to a certain degree.
Sure.
Yeah, like the kind of way that you're thinking about trying to simulate a non-specific moment in time, and how you're using AI pathfinding to try and replicate that, seems to me something of that sort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly. Me and my group, we're taking a lot from games here. We use the Unity engine for this, which we find is really robust and certainly suitable for our purposes.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about specific interactions, obviously you can move around within this space and you can watch the cycle of the day continue.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't ever just sit there for 24 hours. You can speed it up and you can slow it down. but you're not interacting with it per se. You know,
Yeah.
you're not. We're looking at options to kind of change the numbers of agents and kind of play around with densities of things. Those are kind of broad scale controls, but we haven't brought those in yet.
Yeah.
I think if we're getting down to the stage of how a player would interact with characters, or particularly if there was a guiding narrative or a set of waypoints, or that I think precipitates a completely different design.
Yeah.
And that's the design of a game, which then the environment is accommodates.
Yes.
Whereas this is what we're doing is we're taking some really useful game technologies. For example, you know, the pathfinding and navigation, and we're just using those to simulate time and space in history.
Yeah.
You can never do that accurately. It's explorative.
Yes, of course.
But also using that, also simulate other things. For example, all kinds of sounds, as we said, what the vegetation, what the ecology of the environment would be like. We get information of that stuff from pollen cores, and you know, we talked about, you know, fabrics, what people are wearing, even all kinds of archaeological artifacts that we might be able to scan and bring into this world and put back in context. So there's all kinds of stuff that's being drawn into this space.
Yeah.
But is it interactive in a game yet? Not yet, but you could kind of say that, I guess we're kind of doing what in very detailed historical game worlds, you'd have a whole team of texture artists, 3D modelers, sound designers, animators, all making the backdrop for this historical world.
Yeah.
And this would go on whether the main player is there or not. You could say this is the kind of the backdrop, the consistent world. We're kind of doing that, but we're not doing that in order for a main player, a first-person character, or any other characters to come into that.
Yeah.
It's there anyway. So in that sense, it's similar to what some game companies do.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you a few questions about some games that have attempted to do interesting things with history.
Yeah.
But before we get there, there's an interesting thing that's sort of halfway between your sort of work and that sort of work.
Yeah.
Which is a little thing that I've tried recently on PlayStation VR called the Grand Museum VR. Yeah. Have you heard of it?
No, I haven't seen it.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's basically it's a virtual art gallery, more or less.
Yep.
It was created by this organisation called IG3D. And they use things like photogrammetry, which you might be able to explain.
Sure.
Yeah. And they essentially just took artworks, they scanned real artworks from real museums. They photographed, they scanned them, and they rendered them as 3D objects for a user using a PSVR headset to examine in virtual space. So I was pretty impressed by the way that they handled it, and the rendering was pretty good, given the resolution limitations and so on. But it was ultimately kind of alienating for me, because the pieces lacked any contextual information by which I could make sense of what I was looking at. And particularly given that I wasn't personally familiar with the history of, for example, ancient Asia, they threw a lot of artifacts at me, but I couldn't make head or tail of it without any extra information, and there really was none.
Yes. So
how do you think a hypothetical successor could fix this issue while taking advantage of the unique opportunities afforded by the controller, for example?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, this is something I've thought about, because, so first of all, photogrammetry, laser scanning. A lot of your listeners be familiar with this, but photogrammetry is really it's just a way of capturing the 3D form of an object by taking lots of digital photographs of it.
Yeah.
So let's. For example, imagine you have a little statuette, maybe 20 centimeters high, a little bronze statuette from a museum collection. You would ideally put that on a pedestal or somewhere where you could kind of navigate around it with a camera. You'd probably take maybe even 100 photographs of all sides of it, top, bottom, side, any angle you can. You send that off. Often you can send it online. You send all these photographs off to somewhere like Autodesk. Used to have one of these algorithms just crunched all these things and gave you back a 3D model from these photographs. It has to be done it has to be done right, because it's easily you kind of mess it up and you get a kind of model that really looks like it's been melted a little bit, because so it's hard to get it just right.
Yeah.
That's one way you can scan an object in. Another way is with structured light scanners or even laser scanners, these could be handheld, and it's the same kind of process, but you're kind of moving the scanner over the object in kind of sweeps to keep capturing the geometry, and it gets more and more accurate.
Okay.
So museums do this a lot because it's a really good way to preserve objects, because you have a kind of a digital copy of them, a digital duplicate, and often this will also capture the physical surface. Whether it's say a painted wooden statue, or maybe it's bronze, maybe it's another kind of metal. You can capture small details of it. So in case these artifacts were stolen or lost, or destroyed in a fire, which can happen, as we know, there's a digital copy floating around there on the internet, and you can ideally 3D print these out again. You'd have a kind of a surrogate, never quite as good as the original, but better than nothing.
Sure.
So, in these kind of VR experience, like the one you're talking about, I think I have seen some earlier versions of these years ago, where people were first starting to scan museum collections, and didn't have VR headsets, weren't as readily available, but you just go on the internet and you get some kind of the head of a Roman statue or something that you could turn around and look at from various angles and zoom in and out of.
Yep.
It's kind of the same thing, but now you have the controllers and you're in the VR space.
Yeah.
So the context's a really interesting question, Liam, because often in these museums all over the world, not just for Angkor, but for all kinds of cultures, you can go into a museum and everything will be in these little glass boxes, and of course there'll be really informative little blurbs next to them about the date and the discovery and the significance of that particular object.
Yeah.
But they're all divorced from the general context in which they once found themselves.
Yeah.
So particular statues would be part of particular shrines, part of particular religious practice. Often they would have been painted, whereas now they're not painted.
Yeah.
The paint's worn away. They could be, they might be funerary, they might be in tombs, so they might have never have really been designed to be seen by living people, but rather by deities in the afterlife.
Sure.
We don't know that. Right? This would all be on the blurb, but you wouldn't see them in the tomb necessarily. So I think in context, I think for something like that, I think this gets back to it's one thing to just look at the 3D form of something.
Yeah.
But to really see it in context is to actually try and imagine the original placement of where that statue or that artifact, where it would have been, what it was made for. That's harder.
Yeah.
But a lot of art historians have a really good idea about that. So, for example, I'll just to go to Angkor as a particular example, you get these things called palanquin fittings, and a palanquin, if you remember, that's kind of this kind of hammock that you'd have two people carrying a higher status person around. They'd sit on the hammock and people would carry them on the pole. And it had these really ornate bronze fittings that the hammock would hang from.
Yeah.
And these have been preserved when a lot of other stuff at Angkor hasn't.
Oh, good.
So they're in museum collections, and you often see them in glass cases, and they'll tell you about the style of the palanquin fitting and what materials are made of.
Okay.
It would be great if you could just somehow see a fully reconstructed palanquin.
Yeah.
And the sweat glistened shoulders of the poor guys who had to lift it up, and hear the sound of the bronze on bronze squeaking as the hammock rocked back and forth. Then you'd have the full context and the full understanding of that artifact.
Yeah.
Which I think virtual reality affords you all these possibilities. It's really powerful. But just to have something floating in front of you that you can manipulate, that's just first step stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yes, in the context, you could have some voice telling you about it. You can have some pictures popping up around. But I would say the premise of a project like mine, and we really only started to experiment with this, is how will we get all these disparate objects inside glass cases in museums around the world? How could you scan them and then bring them into the virtual world?
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting time when you've got crossover between the real and virtual world. It's so easy now to scan real physical objects, bring them into virtual reality.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you can 3D print objects that were maybe made entirely in the virtual world. They're handcrafted by 3D modelers, for instance. They've never existed in the real world.
Sure.
They've only existed on computer screens. You can now print these out in metal or plastic or all kinds of other materials. So I'm really interested in this back and forth between the real and the virtual, which I think is going to be a very interesting place to be in the next 5-10 years, and particularly for a project that's like this one, where there's a lot of handmade models that we're just making with references to photographs and references to bas-relief sculptures, references to illustrations, to paintings, to all kinds of things. We're looking at these and then crafting the models carefully by hand. And on the other hand, there's things we can scan in from museum collections, which they're physical remains. How to merge these two things together in a virtual world? That's really the big question.
Yeah.
It's not easy to do. It's easy to just bring anything in. It's much harder to try and see how it might have been used.
Yeah.
See what was around it and how people handled it.
Yeah.
That's really difficult, and I'm sure and I'm sure you get a lot of experts disagreeing with and arguing about ways it might have been used, and what is particularly if the object's got religious significance.
Yeah.
But that's exactly the point of these virtual worlds. You can hypothesize these things, and I think this is a very powerful thing you can do with the scholarship going forward. Is seeing these objects brought into a virtual world and then experimented with in different kinds of contexts, with different kinds of moving figures and reconstructions, that often triggers a lot of ideas amongst experts that wouldn't have been there before. Triggers ideas for new questions.
Yeah.
Because you can see things in front of you which you didn't possibly imagine before. It's not saying that we've hit upon some prediction or we've uncovered some hidden secret of the past through our modelling.
Yeah.
It's more opening up new questions. Yeah.
It seems to me that's incredibly important.
Yeah.
And very exciting.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, one of the games I wanted to talk to you about, which could potentially point in directions like that, is Assassin's Creed.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So most of my listeners will be familiar with Assassin's Creed as a series, but it's kind of almost they almost by necessity of subject and their premise, they've been fairly interested in virtually representing history, particularly through how their cities are designed. So a lot of credit has been given to their architecture. People making jokes that after the fire at Notre Dame, that the architects would go and consult Assassin's Creed Unity to help reconstruct it. Yeah.
Yep.
But prior to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, they had information in a kind of codex, but something that was frustrating about it was that they had also included buildings and objects and events that were made up for the games. And going back through the codex recently, I found that they actually didn't distinguish between the made-up stuff and the real stuff. So it's particularly frustrating to use as a historical resource, because you don't know what they've made up and what they're actually trying to draw from historical sources. But with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, they decided to double down on the kind of historical reference, and they created a new mode called Discovery Mode.
Yep.
So this is for the listeners. This is a game mode without quests or combat, in which the player can alternate between freely navigating the world and undertaking guided tours, complete with voice narration, describing the historical reference of the in-game objects and buildings, etc. What are your thoughts on this sort of mode, and do you think it should be adopted more broadly in video games with historical settings?
Sure. Look, I really like the mode that I've seen mainly for. I've had a look at the one that's what's the Egyptian one called? It's Origins, isn't it?
Origins, yeah.
Yes, I really liked that, and I can see the value in it. And I know just from talking to historians, if there's any historians who are around about 30 years old, they've always got something to say about Assassin's Creed. And mostly it's quite positive. They're always really impressed with the detail that Ubisoft has put into these scenes. So getting back to your question, though, I guess, there's so much uncertainty about the past. And I think if it's a general... It depends on the context it's being used for, but if you're really giving it to, say, high school students or even, middle school students, you could say, and they want to have a look at ancient Egypt, let's say, and they want to move around it can kind of break the immersion if too much is uncertain, because then you'll just have massive gaps everywhere. And how do you really reconcile that? I think the important thing is to be honest about which parts have had to be filled in to keep things consistent, and to I guess keep the illusion of the whole historical world as operating quite seamlessly. Yeah. Because you don't want to suddenly turn a corner of a street and have everything just semi-opaque or not really there because nobody knows. Yes. And I mean, really, if you're going to be seriously accurate, I mean, a lot of the time with these historical worlds, if they're set quite a long time ago, it'd be like going through a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing, because there really would be that much missing. Yeah. So there's, I guess that's part of the answer. I guess it depends on the context that it's being used for, and as long as it's, I think a lot of the benefits in the reconstruction of the historical space holistically, all the characters and the sound and the colors and the light and all the architectural forms, all the sculptural forms, all the people, all the animals, all the birds. I think all that stuff, taken holistically, gives a sense of that historical environment. Yeah. That I think it's worthwhile gliding over some of the parts that are uncertain. Yeah. And as long as again, I think we get back to our the earlier point that as long as people, it's understood as it's just a simulation. It's based on a lot of historical information, and it's some of these worlds can be based on much more information than other games, and it's trying to keep faithful to the historical sources, but it's just a play space. Yeah, it's kind of like a living museum, and we talked about and I think as long as it's presented in that vein, I think it's okay. Yeah, yeah. So I think, look, everyone with a project like Angkor, one of the natural avenues is high school education. Yep. Or what is it to kind of visit a virtual Angkor? Let's run around in it. Let's have a look at it. Yeah. We've done some little tests like that. Those are kind of fun, and I think you can embed a lot of information in there. But I think it's great is if students are traveling around within that space, if they can know what is still not quite certain and what is on better authority and what is well known. Yeah. And that will be, as long as it's kind of balanced in a way that it doesn't wreck the whole thing and become too pedantic about the limits of evidence, then I think it's a valuable thing. Sure. Yeah.
Okay. It seems to me that the developers were pretty concerned with the caveats you've mentioned. Because in some of the narration, I was playing Origins recently, the Discovery mode, and some of the narration actually makes it clear where they've had to make inferences because the historical record is patchy. Yeah. So, for example, I went out from Alexandria to the islands of Pharos, and I was wandering around, and they were giving a guided tour, and they were talking about temples that may have existed, and they said, now look, we actually don't have any information concretely as to where any of these temples were. We have an indication there probably were some temples, but as to where exactly they were on the island or what they look like, we just don't know. So we have had to go out on a limb because they didn't want the problem that you mentioned of just coming onto an area with nothing there or have it be semi-opaque.
Yes.
Yeah, so they said, okay, we're just making an inference or just doing a simulation. So just know that these are not authoritative.
Yes.
In that sort of sense.
Yep.
Yeah, so it seems to me that they're concerned with that sort of similar thing. And it works from a perspective of a player.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think, it's important, I guess, with education and, where this could be going for, whether it's high school or perhaps even university students.
Yeah.
Who are doing history or, say, the study of ancient cities or urbanism. They might be studying these kind of courses at a tertiary level. And imagine that these scenes are brought into teaching. They're brought into the tutorials.
Yeah.
Same thing with schools. I think it's really important to know that games shouldn't replace traditional teaching, but rather augment it.
Yeah.
And I think that's so. The tutor, the lecturer, or the high school teacher could put their students into this world for 5 or 10 minutes, but give them some things to look for before they go in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they're not just running around inside there thinking, well, this is an interesting game, what do I do next? Or let's just run, this is over really quickly, or maybe I don't really like the graphics here, it's not as good as the games I play. All these kinds of other things.
Yeah.
But they're there to, maybe there's discussion before they go into it. They go into it, they're looking for particular things, they're paying attention to particular things, they're examining particular things, and they're coming out of it and then they're discussing it. And I think there's a lot of power in that to augment traditional education. I think that there's always a bit too much hype around new technologies. How much of an impact virtual reality, and by extension virtual reality with interactive game worlds, how much of an impact that's going to make upon teaching and education.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, but the main thing is it's kind of that it should be designed so it augments traditional teaching.
Yeah.
Because I think it's too bold a claim to say that this could eventually replace teaching altogether.
Yeah. I think you're probably right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a nice sober conclusion,
yeah.
I think. Because there is a bit of a tendency to get carried away with the potential of these sort of systems. I think maybe the development of the internet over the last couple of decades might have simmered down the sort of techno-optimism of the 90s.
Yeah, and I think, it always gets back to the danger, doesn't it? Like, it's like we discussed before when 3D graphics was really emerging as a technology that you'd often see in museums and on the internet back in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
What if you had a really detailed virtual world, one that had more detail than all the others, that absorbed more information than all the others that were around? Is that then the authority on that particular civilization or culture? Would everyone think that is the authority?
Yeah.
And that's a... See, there's different interpretations. So even a team of modelers combined with historians and researchers, however big that team is, what they're going to produce, like a game, it's still going to be kind of one version of these.
Yeah.
Someone else can produce something else. It could have other evidence, conflicting ideas. So I guess that is also the danger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good point. Here's an interesting thing about Assassin's Creed. They actually deliberately included a few inaccuracies, and they point them out in the narration. For example, they include female students among the people listening to lectures and their reconstruction of the library at Alexandria.
Yes.
And I said, probably wouldn't have been the case, given what we know about Greek society.
Yep.
But we're doing it because I believe they said they don't feel the need to tie themselves to historical sexism in order to reproduce a simulation of the past.
Yep.
Yeah, and there was also a technical issue. Like there was a certain canal in a lake that they said that they couldn't reproduce because of problems at scale. Yeah. Yep. So what do you think about these deliberate sort of alterations to historically accurate understanding for political or technical reasons?
Yeah. Again, it depends if it's made clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. It depends if it's that would be if this was actually used in an educational context, that would be the job of the instructor or the teacher to actually discuss that with the students.
Yeah.
And then they can go experience it themselves. Look, it has a lot to do with the reach of these kind of... When we're talking about historical world like the one you've described, and they want it to be open to pretty much everyone. They want it to be kind of inclusive and stuff. So I can totally see why they do that. I think we have had a similar... not a similar, but a related issue with Angkor. And that's... at Angkor, everybody went... naked from the waist up. That is, they always had something on under their waist.
Yeah.
So it's kind of it's kind of like a sarong. So everyone was clothed. No one was naked, but men and women wore nothing from the waist up. So the women were topless, and so were the men.
Right.
It's part of the climate. It's just part of the way it was. And I think early Bali, in the 1900s, Bali was like that as well. And then, so we got this problem of topless women everywhere.
Right.
Which can be a real problem if you're making educational walkthroughs of Angkor for Year 8 students.
Yeah.
Or primary school students, talking to teachers. They said it would be really hard because you never know when there's a very conservative school or very conservative parents that would complain about this.
Yeah.
So we have to... But to have the women wearing kind of coverings over their breasts will be totally historically inaccurate because they didn't do that then. And this is attested in the bas-reliefs and everywhere else. So what we have to do is just be kind of... It's almost... if this was going out to schools, for some of the animations we've done, this is years ago, or even some very small interactive scenes, which you did early on, the women would be topless, but they'd be far away or they'd be turned in the other direction.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't see too many breasts that could get, that could bring about complaints. But yet we still didn't cover any of the women up.
Sure.
Sometimes we were doing some silly things like strategic nudity, where you could see two women talking, but there was an ox cart just in front of them, and just happened to be at the, just breast height, and all these things that we're doing. But these are some of the. I think it relates back to your problem. It's some of, depending on the audience, you do have to pull a few tricks.
Yeah.
The reality of. The strangeness of history, if you're supposed to really represent it, I think would shock a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that is something for game, but the practices of history and how strange some cultures were, how strange people were to us now.
Yeah.
I think would be deeply shocking to some people. Some of the practices, I'm talking around the world, not being specific about anyone, but it would be... People would find a lot of these things very hard to deal with in a modern context. Yeah. That's a question for another kind of historical visualization.
Yeah.
And this, again, would be... It does go back to games a bit, but if we're really going to get accurate, some of these historical visualizations, I'm not just talking about the violence, I'm talking about things that people really wouldn't understand. Why historical cultures did what they did. Yeah. And it could be all kinds of things, but I think to really accurately represent some of these things, you might even end up with like an R rating for some of these. Yep. But this is casting well ahead into the future.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's actually amazingly relevant to the final thing I want to ask you.
Sure.
Which is about a second game I wanted to talk to you about, which is Kingdom Come Deliverance. It kind of... It explicitly marketed itself on being historically accurate. Yeah, so it's a first-person role-playing game from Czech developer Warhorse, set in the Kingdom of Bohemia in the year 1403, essentially medieval Czechoslovakia. So it's a game which proudly sold itself on that claim to be, this is a historically accurate, this is a representation, a simulation of what it was like in the 15th century in Bohemia.
Yes.
Yeah, but certain critics have argued that the developers have actually, while they've nailed things like period architecture, dress, and how weapons work, that sort of thing, they've actually provided a sort of very Czech nationalist interpretation of the political instability which marked Bohemia at the time. And so you kind of mentioned this earlier to me with your discussion of the project and the Assassin's Creed developers have been upfront about this. But what do you think about the role of political implications of this kind of virtual historical work, and should people involved in this sort of work be careful about it?
Yeah, that's a really important, loaded question. It's really, it's a big one too. In that particular example you discussed, I mean, it's made by Czech developers.
Yeah.
And yet they're addressing their own history.
Exactly.
And I think this goes back to it's kind of hard to avoid. It goes back into the history of cinema and stuff. You look at how some early movies were made and where they were made. If they were made by Australians or they were made by Brazilians at a certain time.
Yeah.
They were made about that country. Then on the one hand, they've got someone making a game or a movie about their own country in their own language and their own history. You can argue in many ways they have kind of a deeper understanding or a deeper connection to that stuff. Where it gets into politics, though, and the political implications of this, I was thinking about this. It's kind of it's hard to avoid, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's
I think
hard to avoid, particularly if it is your own culture, and then if you're making a game or a movie about another culture that isn't your own, not even you might not even be distantly related to that. You're just interested in that. Then that's more difficult all over again.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult one to answer. I think it does come down to the motivations. Some of it can be accidental.
Yep.
Then again, to look at it from the flip side and say, well, if you're going to try and steer yourself clear of all these minefields of what might be interpreted as nationalistic or might be interpreted as taking one side of history, if you steer clear of all of that, what do you have?
Yeah. That is a difficult...
Eventually, you do have to take some kind of side. In most of these games, and it depends which character you'd follow, or which, and then you've got games which have factions, and you can take two. I trying to think it through. I think there's ways you could address this by being able to take on the role of different factions. Yeah, and then you have different motivations for different angles of which the people can play the game. Or, view this stuff. Even so, it's hard to know how you can steer clear of these things. Yeah. And again, it does come back to people from a particular country making a game about their own heritage. Who's better qualified?
It's a good point.
Probably them. Yeah. But yeah.
Okay, that's a fair point. Yeah. Right. Well, kind of related to that. A common theme in this discussion has been the limitations of exactly how much we can know about the past based on what has survived. Yes. And it's sort of like the premise of the show is a kind of early anxiety about what future histories of games will look like if we don't actually carry on with an effort to preserve what's going on right now. Because future historians will run up against these issues. So it seems there's a book that I had a look at called What is History? And the author is a guy called E.H. Carr. He describes a sort of predicament of a modern historian. So he's like, we can't believe, as the Victorian historians maybe used to do, that history is going to progress to some ultimate period of understanding where we have a complete and accurate picture of what the past really was like. And they're also aware of the influence of their own minds and of the contribution that their own time has to how they tell a historical story. Yes. Yeah. So it's and then there's also the issue of the limitations of even primary documents as a sort of windows to the past. Sure. Yeah. Yep. And so related to that, there was an article on the website Rock Paper Shotgun about Kingdom Come: Deliverance by a guy called Andreas Inderwildi, who argued that the pursuit of historical accuracy in games is a fool's errand because of this. And so he argued that Kingdom Come is essentially a fantasy without dragons or magic. As a result of that.
I like that.
yeah, it's a nice sting there. So my question to you is, despite the kind of uncertainty that's inherent in modern historical practice, do you still believe that historically accurate virtual worlds are a worthy aspiration or achievable within reason?
I do, but I think it depends on the limits of what the game developers or the game designers or the game storytellers, what they say is historical accuracy.
Yeah.
And there's different versions or degrees or layers you can have about this. So let's take, I wouldn't call this a superficial layer. I'd consider it a really important environmental layer. So what about the environment of the game?
Yeah.
For example, what if you're thinking about the trees, you're thinking about the buildings. Before you start to talk about the history and the characters and the interaction between people and the language and all that stuff,
yep.
You're just talking about the space of the game. Is the light right? For that part of the world that it's set at historically. What kind of trees are there? What if the game developers get a few things wrong and there's actually trees there that weren't there more than 200 years ago because they're introduced from South America, or they're Australian eucalypts? What are the eucalypts doing there in this in this European sea? It could be like that,
right.
Or something set historically in Southeast Asia. You've got to be very careful not to bring trees in that have come over with the Spanish and the Portuguese from the South American exchange. So these are just the first thing. Then you think about what kind of bird sounds would be there, and is that the right kind of? What does the countryside look like? Is it so that's the first layer of stuff, and then you get to this. So you can have that reasonably right, and you can look at paintings, and you can look at accounts, and you can even look at pollen cores to get that kind of right.
Yeah,
and this is within reason. You don't want to be too fiddly. You just want to get the right kind of trees, the right kind of sounds, the right kind of light there.
Yeah,
so that's the first layer, and then you start to think about the architecture. Well, you can be quite accurate if you've got castles and buildings that are still there today, but are dated to that time that you're trying to reconstruct. So those are good anchors there. And then you've got to think, okay, what about the wooden houses that aren't there now, but were there then? Are there still some of them now? What are the so you can be more. So you're starting to build this world, and you can say up to a point, this is pretty accurate.
Yeah,
we're not sure about exactly the placements of everything, but we're really sure it looked like this and it sounded like this, and these were the kind of trees around at the time. Because not all of it is urban environments, especially if it's historical. You've got to live. Most life is lived outdoors then. So then you get to other things. So you could say it's accurate to that extent. And then you've got the language.
Yes.
So are they speaking in the dialect of the time, which is translated through subtitles at the bottom of the screen?
Yep.
Or, are they speaking with a kind of an accented English? You got to be careful about all these things. How accurate do you want to get? And I think, things like the weapons, things like bringing in for example, what some of the characters are saying. You could be taking excerpts from historical documents, but kind of editing that a lot so it sounds more like they're speaking on the spot, not like reading a script.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's definitely merit in it, and I think that people are always interested in history, and this is why historical documentaries are always so popular.
Yeah,
they're always so popular. There's always a fascination with history, and that's why there's merit in this kind of process, and I think in terms of the game designers, the game companies, the modelers, there's a certain procedure to go through here that is almost like a detective work of trying to assemble the best kind of outcome with the evidence you have. But then, of course, there's always a limit as to how much you know.
Yeah.
The rest of it is kind of filled in speculatively, like someone would write historical fiction. It's how well that's done.
Okay.
Yeah, and how honest people are about it. But so there's definitely this merit to it, and I think it'll be popular. I think this will be. I think this will become increasingly kind of a skill of games developers that not just bringing in a historical consultant, but I think they'll start to be games designers with a real interest in this stuff anyway, that are possibly coming from history, from an understanding of history, but also with an understanding of games. And I think this will be an increasingly an important aspect, because Lord knows we've had enough kind of Tolkien-inspired medieval worlds, Game of Thrones-inspired medieval worlds, which are all great. But people they're just going to want kind of slightly different historical slants on this going forward, I think.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Well, yeah, on that slightly exciting note, I think we'll end the show for today.
Thank you, Liam.
But thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been great to hear all you've had to say.
Yes, and thank you for taking time to come in and have a look at this project and have a talk about it. It's been lots of fun.
It's absolutely incredible, by the way.